"You'll never find someone better than me," she said confidently. I smiled and replied, "That's not what I'm looking for." Then I left quietly and let reality prove her wrong over time. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. Thanks. "You'll never find someone better than me." She said it like she was stating the weather. Calm, certain, almost bored. Like the words themselves were so obviously true that saying them out loud was just a formality. I looked at her standing in the middle of our apartment, arms crossed, chin slightly raised, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not sadness, something quieter than both. I smiled. Not a big smile, not a mocking one, just a small, tired, honest curve of my lips. And I said, "That's not what I'm looking for." Then I walked to the bedroom, pulled out the bag I had already packed 2 days ago, picked it up without drama, and walked out the front door. She didn't stop me. I think she expected me to stop myself. Let me back up just a little. I was 29. She was 27. We had been together for 3 years, living together for 1. Her name was Claire. And for a long time, I genuinely believed she was the best thing that had ever happened to me. That's the part nobody tells you about relationships like this. It doesn't start bad. It starts wonderful. The first year with Claire was the kind of year that makes you believe in things. She was sharp, funny, beautiful in that effortless way that makes other people stare without realizing they're doing it. She had strong opinions about everything. Music, food, people, politics. And at first, that confidence felt magnetic. She always knew what restaurant to pick. She always had a take on every situation. She never seemed uncertain about anything. And I, who had spent most of my 20s second-guessing every decision I made, found that quietly intoxicating. I liked being near someone who seemed so sure of herself. It made me feel anchored, safe, like maybe if I stayed close enough to her certainty, some of it would rub off on me. But somewhere around month 14, I started noticing something. It was small at first. So small that I actually argued with myself about whether it was even real. See, Claire's confidence wasn't just about herself. It extended outward, into me, into my choices, into what I wore, who I spent time with, what I was doing with my career, what I should want for my future. She had opinions about all of it, strong ones. And when my choices didn't match her opinions, she didn't get angry exactly. She just got disappointed. This particular kind of quiet, heavy, loaded disappointment that somehow felt worse than yelling. The kind where she'd look at me and say, "I just thought you were smarter than that." Or, I expected more from you, honestly." Or the one that used to gut me the most, "I don't know why you even bother asking for advice if you're just going to do whatever you want anyway." I kept a job in graphic design that I genuinely loved. She thought it was beneath me. Or more accurately, she thought it was beneath her to be with someone whose job didn't impress people at dinner parties. She never said that directly. She said it in other ways. "Don't you want to do something more impactful? I just think you're capable of so much more, babe." My coworker's husband just got promoted to creative director. Just throwing that out there. I'm not making these up. Those are actual sentences she said to me. I started shrinking. Not overnight. Gradually. The way a plant shrinks when it doesn't get enough light. Still alive. Still standing. But smaller than it should be. I stopped mentioning work wins around her because her reaction was always a muted, polite acknowledgement followed by a "but" that swallowed the whole thing whole. I stopped inviting my college friends around as much because she had a specific tolerance threshold for what she called low-effort people. I stopped making plans without running them past her first, not because she demanded it explicitly, but because the emotional cost of doing something she didn't approve of was just too exhausting to deal with regularly. And I told myself this was just what long-term relationships looked like. Compromise, consideration, adjustment. I had never been in a relationship this long before. Maybe this was just normal. Maybe all couples operated like this, and I was just new to the rhythm. There was a guy at my studio named Owen. He had been married for 6 years. One afternoon, we were working late on a project, and he asked me how things were going with Claire. I told him we were good. He looked at me for a second and said, "You used to talk about things you were working on all the time. I haven't heard you do that in a while." I shrugged. I said I'd just been busy. He nodded slowly. In that way, that means he didn't quite believe me, but wasn't going to push. I drove home that evening thinking about what he said, and I realized he was right. I had stopped talking about things I was proud of. Not just to him, to anyone. That night, Claire had a work dinner she wanted me to attend. Her firm was hosting a reception for a new client, and she wanted me there mostly for appearance. I say mostly because she was very specific about certain things at these events. Don't mention the graphic design thing too early. If someone asks what you do, try to lead with the consulting work you did last year. Don't get into your passion project conversations. People find it boring. Stand near her when the senior partners are around. I remember getting dressed and reading these texts she had sent and standing in front of the mirror and barely recognizing the guy I was looking at. Not because I looked different, because I felt like I'd been slowly, methodically edited. Like someone had opened a document of me and deleted all the parts they found inconvenient. I went to the dinner. I played the role. I nodded at the right moments and laughed at the right jokes and said, "We're just keeping busy," when anyone asked what was new. On the drive home, Claire said I did well. She said it like she was grading a performance. "You handled the Thompson conversation really smoothly. See, when you put in the effort, you're actually quite impressive." I stared at the road ahead. I said, "Thank you." She squeezed my hand, and I felt absolutely nothing. That was the first moment I knew. Not a dramatic realization, not a lightning bolt, just a quiet, hollow flatness where warmth used to be. I knew, but knowing and acting on knowing are two completely different things. And I wasn't ready yet, so I kept going. 2 weeks after the dinner, something happened that I think about a lot now. My studio got picked to design the branding for a mid-sized tech company that had been growing fast. It was the biggest project we'd landed in 2 years. I was leading it. My boss pulled me aside and told me the client had specifically requested that I head the team after seeing some of my earlier work. I walked to my car that afternoon with this stupid grin on my face. The kind you can't control. I called Claire on the way home. She picked up. I told her the news. There was a small pause. Then she said, "Oh, nice. How much does a project like that actually pay you, though?" Because I was looking at apartments in the Mercer building, and the rent is basically double what we're paying now. I sat in my car after I hung up. The grin was gone. I'm not sure exactly when it left. She never asked about the project again. Not once. In the weeks that followed, as I pulled long hours and built something I was genuinely proud of, she didn't ask how it was going. She didn't ask about the client. She didn't ask what we were creating. She was consumed with the idea of moving into a more expensive apartment, which she had also decided was primarily my financial responsibility since, quote, "You make more than I do, and it only makes sense." We hadn't discussed that. She had decided it. She presented it as logic. I brought it up one evening. I said I didn't think it was fair to assume the rent split without talking about it first. She looked at me with that particular expression she had, the one where her eyes go just slightly flat. "I'm not assuming anything. I'm being practical. This is what couples do when they're building a future together. Or are you not interested in building a future together?" There it was. The pivot. Every disagreement eventually arrived at the same destination. My commitment. My dedication. Whether or not I was really in this. Like any resistance to her logic was secretly resistance to her. I had learned over time that these conversations only had one exit. Agree, apologize, or endure the cold distance that would last for days if I didn't. That night I agreed to look at the apartment. I told myself it was the mature thing to do. But something had started turning inside me. Slowly at first, then faster. I started noticing how rarely she asked about my day without it leading back to something she wanted to talk about. I started noticing how often I monitored my own words before I said them. Not because I was being polite, but because I had learned which topics were safe and which ones would require emotional labor I didn't have the reserve for. I started noticing how tired I was. Not the physical kind. The bone-deep, soul-level tired that comes from spending years being slightly smaller than you actually are. Owen noticed it at work too. We grabbed lunch one day, just the two of us, and he asked me straight out, "Are you okay?" Like actually okay. I opened my mouth to say yes, and then I didn't. I sat there for a moment and thought about it honestly. "No," I said. "Not really." He didn't say much. He just listened. And that was the first time in probably 18 months that I had talked to someone without editing myself, without wondering how it would land, without measuring the reaction. He asked me what I wanted, not what Claire wanted, not what made sense practically. What did I want? I realized I didn't know anymore. I had been so busy managing her expectations and navigating her moods that I had completely lost track of my own compass. I drove home that afternoon feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Angry, not at Claire, at myself, for letting it go this far. The next few weeks were quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Tense quiet. The kind where you're both still doing the motions, but something underneath has shifted and you both know it and neither of you is willing to name it yet. Claire noticed I was different. She couldn't pin it down exactly, but she could feel the change in the temperature between us. And true to form, her response was to tighten her grip. More opinions, more corrections, more subtle commentary on my choices. She started pushing the apartment move harder. She started dropping more comparisons. Brooke's boyfriend just put a down payment on a condo. Apparently Daniel is taking his girlfriend to Portugal for 2 weeks. Must be nice to be with someone intentional. She never said, you should do these things. She just made sure I knew that other men were doing them. And I understood the message clearly. One evening, I was working from home, deep in the branding project, really in flow, the kind of focused creative state where you forget to look at the clock. Claire came home from work, walked past me without saying hello, and went to the kitchen. I said hi. She said, I texted you 3 times. I checked my phone. She had 3 texts about what she wanted for dinner. I apologized and said I was in the middle of something. She came and stood in the doorway of the office. You're always in the middle of something. I looked up. I said, this project matters to me. She said, I know it does. That's part of the problem. I set my pen down. What does that mean? She did a small, sharp exhale. It means you prioritize work over us constantly. It means I come home and you barely look up. It means I'm starting to wonder if I'm even a priority in your life. I looked at her. I thought about the dinner I had attended and performed at. I thought about the apartment I had agreed to look at. I thought about the project news she hadn't asked about once. I said, that's interesting. Excuse me. Nothing. What do you want for dinner? That word, interesting, lived in me for the next few days. Because it wasn't accusatory. It wasn't a fight starter. It was just true. It was genuinely interesting that someone who asked so little about my inner life could feel so confident claiming that they were being deprioritized. And that was the moment something clicked. The relationship didn't feel bad because I was doing something wrong. It felt bad because the fundamental dynamic was broken. She wasn't interested in me. She was interested in the version of me that made her life easier, more impressive, more comfortable. When I was performing that role well, she was happy. When I had needs, preferences, or a focus that didn't directly serve her, I became a problem. That's not a partnership. That's a supporting role. And I had been playing it for 3 years. I didn't make a sudden decision. I sat with it. Weeks. I went back and forth constantly. Because the thing about a long relationship is that it accumulates weight. History, shared jokes, trips you took together. That one terrible week when her father was in the hospital and you barely slept and you sat beside her every night because she couldn't bear the quiet. All of that is real. All of that matters. And it makes it complicated because you're not just deciding about the present. You're deciding what to do with everything that's been built. And it's heavy, genuinely heavy. But one afternoon, I was sitting at my desk and I was going through some old photos on my phone, not looking for anything specific, just scrolling. And I found a photo from about a year before I met Claire. I was at some outdoor festival with a group of friends. I was mid-laugh, not a posed smile, a real, open, completely unguarded laugh. My eyes were crinkled. I looked like a person who had absolutely no interest in managing anyone's perception of him. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then I looked in the reflection of my dark laptop screen. Same face, different eyes. I had the look of someone who was always slightly braced, always waiting, always monitoring. I put my phone down. I packed a bag that evening while she was at her spin class. I didn't pack everything, just enough. I left it in the back of the closet and went back to the kitchen and made dinner like nothing had happened. 3 days later, the conversation happened. The one I told you about at the beginning. It started because of a phone call. An old friend of mine, a guy I'd known since university, called me that afternoon to tell me he was getting married. He wanted me at the engagement party the following weekend. It was out of town, 2-hour drive, small gathering. I said yes without hesitation. When I told Claire, she went quiet. Then she said, that's the same weekend as Brooke's thing. I said, I know, but this is my friend. I haven't seen him in almost a year. She said, I told Brooke we'd both be there. You told her without asking me first. I didn't think it was necessary to ask. It's a reasonable assumption. I said, Claire, I'm going to my friend's engagement party. That landed differently than my usual tone. She registered it. I saw it move across her face. The flat eyes came out. Fine. Go. I will. But just so you know, this is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. You make your own plans and expect me to adjust. And I always do. I'm always the one adjusting. I thought about the dinner I performed at, the apartment I agreed to look at, the projects I stopped mentioning, the friends I stopped seeing, the laugh I used to have that I couldn't find in my own reflection anymore. You're always adjusting, I repeated quietly. Yes. Okay. That made her angrier. The calm agreement made her angrier than pushback would have. What is going on with you lately? Nothing. That's not true. You've been cold for weeks. You've been distant and weird, and I don't know what I've done to deserve it. I took a breath, and for the first time in a very long time, I decided to be completely honest. I don't think you've done something specific. I think we want fundamentally different things. She stared at me. What does that mean? It means I don't think this relationship makes me better. I think it makes me smaller. And I don't think that's what either of us should want. The room went very still. Then her expression shifted. The flat eyes became something else. Something hard and bright and certain. She stood up straighter. And she said it. You'll never find someone better than me. No hesitation. No doubt. Just pure, polished certainty. Like she had been keeping that sentence in reserve. Like it was the final argument she'd been waiting for the right moment to deploy. And I understood in that moment exactly what she was doing. She was using her own value as a cage. She was saying, you can't afford to lose me. You don't have the luxury of walking away. Whatever I am, whatever this is, it's the ceiling of what you can hope for. And what I felt wasn't what she expected. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel afraid. I felt something clarify, like fog lifting off a road. I smiled. It surprised her. I could see it. She expected tears, or anger, or the familiar backtrack where I apologized for things that weren't my fault and promised to do better. I smiled and I said, that's not what I'm looking for. She blinked. What? I'm not looking for the best person. I'm looking for the right fit. And I'm not that for you, and you're not that for me. And I think you've known that for a while too. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. You're being ridiculous. Probably. You're going to regret this. Maybe. You'll come back. I picked up my bag from the closet. I walked past her. I stopped at the door. I looked at her one last time. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. Just with a kind of sad, clear honesty. I hope you find exactly what you're looking for, I said. I genuinely mean that. And then I left. The first week was strange. I stayed at Owen's place. He had a spare room, and he didn't ask 1,000 questions, and he made coffee in the mornings without making it a whole thing, and I cannot tell you how much I needed exactly that. I felt simultaneously lighter and hollowed out. That's the only way I can describe it. Like I had been carrying something so long that the absence of its weight felt disorienting. My body didn't know what to do without the tension it had been holding for years. I slept badly. I dreamed about stupid things. An old apartment I lived in when I was 23. A road trip I had taken alone years ago. My brain processing something, I think. Working through the inventory of who I had been before I got quiet. Claire texted me on day 3. We need to talk. I wrote back. I know what you want to say, and I've said what I needed to say. I think space is better for both of us right now. She didn't respond. Then she texted again on day 5. You are making a massive mistake. I read it. I put my phone down. I didn't reply. The branding project was still ongoing at work. And something funny happened. Without the weight of managing Claire's needs in the back of my mind constantly, I started working differently. Faster. More freely. I was making decisions on the project without second-guessing every instinct. The client loved the direction we were taking. My boss pulled me into his office one afternoon and told me the client had told him specifically that they appreciated the boldness of the work, that it felt confident without being aggressive, that it had a real point of view. I walked back to my desk and I thought about that word, confident. And I thought about how for years I had been with someone who embodied confidence, and somehow, being near it had made me less confident. Not more. Because her confidence wasn't the kind that made room for other people's. It was the kind that required you to stay smaller so she could stay large. That's not confidence. That's control wearing confidence's clothes. I found an apartment of my own about 3 weeks after leaving. Small. 3rd floor. 1 bedroom. A little loud from the street below. I loved it immediately. I painted one wall in the living room a dark navy because I had always wanted to do something like that and had been told it would make the space feel too small. The space did not feel too small. The space felt like mine. I bought a plant. A big, dramatic monstera that had absolutely no practical purpose and took up an unreasonable amount of corner space. I named it something dumb that I will never tell another person. I slept better in that apartment in the first week than I had in the last year of my life. I called my friend back. The one getting married. His name was Felix. We hadn't talked much over the last year, and that was mostly on me. He was one of the people who had ended up in the low-effort category that Claire had a particular distaste for. Not because he was actually low-effort, but because he was loud and opinionated and took up a lot of social oxygen in a way that didn't fit neatly into the version of me she wanted to present. I called him and I said, I should have been a better friend this past year. He said, yeah, you were kind of MIA. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I noticed you changed, man. You got careful, like you were constantly checking yourself. I was. She do that to you? I thought about it. I let her. He didn't let me off the hook with that, either. Yeah, he said, but you also let it happen. So what are you going to do about it? Fair. The engagement party was 3 weeks later. I drove out there on a Saturday morning with the windows down and music up in a way I hadn't done in so long I had actually forgotten how much I liked doing it. The party was small. Felix and his fiancée Charlotte, a handful of old friends, some family members. And I walked in, and for the first time in what felt like years, I was just me. No performance. No curated version. No monitoring. Someone asked what I did and I talked about graphic design and the branding project, and I watched their faces light up with genuine interest, and I thought, oh right, this is what it feels like when the thing you do is allowed to be interesting. We stayed until nearly midnight. I drove home alone, tired in the good way, and I had this thought, that the version of me that existed in that room tonight was someone I actually liked. Not despite the absence of Claire. Because of it. Months passed, and here's where the story becomes less about me and more about what happened around me. I heard things through mutual friends. Not because I was seeking information, because it has a way of finding you regardless. About 6 weeks after we separated, Claire started dating a man she worked with. His name was apparently Philip. He was in her firm. Senior position. Exactly the kind of person she had always wanted to be partnered with. I heard this and felt nothing bad about it. Genuinely. I hoped it worked out. But then about 4 months in, things apparently got complicated. I got a text from a mutual friend named Gabby. She didn't beat around the bush. She said, Claire is having a rough time. Philip broke things off. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. Gabby said, she's been saying some things. What kind of things? A pause. That she made a mistake. With you. I looked at my phone for a moment. Then I said, she didn't make a mistake. We just weren't right. Gabby said, I know. I just thought you should know. 3 days after that text, Claire called me. I almost didn't pick up, but I did. She sounded different. Quieter than I had ever heard her. That coiled certainty was still there, but underneath it was something that sounded like the beginning of self-awareness. Not quite there yet, but reaching toward it. She said, I've been thinking about a lot of things. I said, okay. I think I was hard on you. I said, I think you were hard on both of us. A pause. Philip and I heard, I'm sorry it didn't work out. Another pause. I think she expected me to be satisfied by the information. Like I would experience it as some kind of victory. And I want to be honest about this. There was no victory. There was no vindication. There was just a person on the phone who was hurting. And whatever had happened between us, I had no interest in adding to that. I don't think you were a bad person, I said carefully. I think you had a very specific idea of the life you wanted. And you needed a partner who would fit that picture perfectly. And I wasn't going to be that. Not because I wasn't good enough. Because that wasn't the picture I was building. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I used to think those were the same thing. I said, I know. Are you okay? Yeah, I actually am. You sound different. I'm sure I do. Another pause. She said, I think I said something really cruel to you that night. You did. I was scared. I know that too. Does it matter now? Me saying it was cruel? I thought about it honestly. It matters that you know it. For your sake. Not for mine. I could hear her breathing. Then she said quietly, I think I wanted to keep you. I know. Not for the right reasons. No. We said goodbye without any ceremony. I put my phone down. Looked around my apartment. At the navy wall. At the absurdly large monstera. At the desk covered in project notes. At the window where I'd been watching the city for months, slowly remembering what it was like to be unedited. I want to tell you something about that phrase, she said. You'll never find someone better than me. Because I've thought about it a lot. And here's what I think she was actually saying. She was saying, you need me. She was saying, your worth is measured by your proximity to me. She was saying, leaving is not an option you should seriously consider because the math doesn't work in your favor. But what she missed, what so many people miss when they say things like that, is that better is not a fixed category. There is no universal better. There is only right for who you are and what you're building and where you're trying to go. And for me, right was not a person who made me feel like a draft in need of editing. Right was someone who would read the draft and say, this is interesting, tell me more. Or I was someone who would ask about the project, who would notice when I went quiet, who would want me to be larger, not smaller, who would experience my confidence as something to celebrate, not something that threatened their own. I had no idea yet if I'd ever find that person, but I had learned something more fundamental first. I had to be that person for myself, before anyone else could be it for me. The branding project launched to the public about 7 months after I had left. My boss threw a small party at the studio. Nothing extravagant, just the team, a few bottles of wine, some food. We stood around the big monitor watching the campaign go live. When the final assets dropped on the client's website and social, there was this moment, just a moment, where the room was quiet. And then one of the junior designers said, "That's actually really beautiful." And everyone laughed and clinked glasses, and it was not a massive moment in the grand scheme of anyone's life. But it was mine. It was mine in a way nothing had felt like mine in a very long time. And I stood there with a glass of wine and thought about the person who had packed that bag 2 days before the conversation, who had stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized himself, who had driven to a friend's apartment and slept badly for a week while his body figured out how to hold itself without bracing. I thought about him with a kind of compassion that surprised me. He had stayed too long. He had been too accommodating. He had swallowed too much. But he had also, eventually, picked up the bag and walked out the door. And that mattered. I saw Claire one more time, about a year after we split. It was accidental. I was at a coffee place near a part of the city I didn't usually frequent, waiting for a client meeting that had been relocated last minute. She walked in. We both saw each other at exactly the same time. That particular brand of awkward. She looked good. Not the same as before. Something was different about her, actually. She looked a little less polished. A little more real. We said hello. We asked the basic questions. Work is good. How about you? Yeah, things are good. Then she said something I didn't expect. You look happy. I thought about how to answer that. I think I am, I said. She nodded. Then she said, with a kind of honesty that felt new from her, I think I spent a long time being confident about the wrong things. I looked at her. What do you mean? She stirred her coffee. I was always so sure about what I wanted in a partner. What he should look like, sound like, do, earn, present as. I had this very clear image. And I thought that confidence about the image meant I knew what I needed. But I think. She trailed off. I think I confused knowing what I wanted with knowing who I was. I didn't say anything. I let her have the sentence. She looked up. Anyway, I'm working on it. That's a good thing to work on. She smiled. It was small. It was actually genuine. You were good to me, she said. I wasn't always good back. No, but I also didn't always ask for what I needed. That's on me too. We stood there for a moment longer. Then she picked up her coffee. Good luck with everything, she said. You too, I said. And we went our separate ways. And that was that. Here's the thing about letting reality prove someone wrong. It's not satisfying the way you'd imagine. When you're in the middle of the pain, when you've just packed the bag and your hands are shaking slightly, and you're not sure if you're making the bravest decision of your life or the stupidest, you imagine that someday the proof will arrive, that the world will arrange itself into clear evidence that you were right and they were wrong, that you'll feel vindicated, complete, like the final scene of a movie where everything clicks into place and the music swells. It's not like that. What actually happens is quieter. What actually happens is that you gradually, month by month, find your way back to yourself. You start working without bracing. You start talking without editing. You start making choices, small ones, big ones, based on what you actually want rather than what will produce the least friction. And one day you're standing in your apartment with the navy wall and the ridiculous plant, and you realize you can't actually remember the last time you felt afraid of yourself. That's not a movie scene. It doesn't have a soundtrack, but it is the actual victory. I'm not telling this story because I'm bitter. I want to be clear about that. Claire was not a villain. She was a person with her own fears, her own wounds, her own particular way of trying to feel safe in the world. Her way happened to be control. Her way happened to be certainty, loud, constant, aimed outward. That's a response to something. I don't know what. I don't need to know. It's enough to understand that her behavior came from somewhere, and that somewhere is hers to excavate, not mine. I'm telling this story because I think a lot of people know exactly what it feels like to be slowly edited, to have your volume turned down, not with cruelty, not with dramatic abuse, but with 1,000 small adjustments, each one individually defensible, each one carrying a tiny cost that you tell yourself is just the price of love. Until the total comes due and you look up and realize you've paid more than you can account for. I'm telling this story because of what she said. You'll never find someone better than me. And how quietly certain I felt when I answered. Not because I knew what was coming next. Not because I had someone waiting. Not because I had a plan or a safety net or any guarantee of anything. But because I knew, with a clarity that arrived without fanfare, that better was not the point. The point was real. The point was honest. The point was someone who wanted me at full volume, not conveniently adjusted to suit the room. And I knew that whatever the future held, I wasn't going to find that by staying somewhere that had quietly convinced me I wasn't worth looking for it. So I smiled. I said what I said. I picked up the bag, and I walked out. And slowly, without drama or announcement, reality did what reality always does. It kept moving, and I moved with it. And that was enough. That was more than enough. If you've ever packed a bag you didn't show anyone, you already know what this story is really about. You already know.